In this video, I will attempt to wrap up Chapter 5 of the Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, leaving us only 2 more chapters to consider in this series. Chapter 5 is on the spirit of Muslim culture, and it's following through on what he outlined at the end of Chapter 1, where he says, knowledge comes by experience plus interpretation, but our interpretations of experience ought to be subjected to reflection, careful scrutiny, testing, and there happily are tests by which we can evaluate beliefs that are derived from religious experience. One of those tests is the pragmatic test, where we judge religious doctrine by its fruits, and specifically, prophecy, he's just explained at the beginning of Chapter 5, is one particular variety of religious experience. A normal mystical experience is one we don't want to come back down from, but prophecy is such that we have to come back down. We need to come back down. We probably even want to. A prophet wants to return to the world and creatively transform it in light of his religious experience, and that gives us the chance to apply the pragmatic test and judge a religion by its fruits. So part of what he's talking about in Chapter 5, and I think this might even be a fairly good summary of most of Chapter 5, but don't quote me on that. Part of what he's talking about is the relation of Islam to ancient classical thought, particularly Greek thought, and the relation of the modern West to Islam. And he says Islam is essentially anti-classical. It's not like the Greeks. And the modern West is also not like the Greeks, and it got its being not like the Greeks from Islam. So, let's look at a few passages, and I'll make a few comments. I won't try to give a thorough reading of Chapter 5. On the 3rd page in my edition, we read, "The Prophet of Islam seems to stand between the ancient and the modern world," etc., etc. Actually, no, let's not etc. that. "Insofar as the source of his revelation is concerned, he belongs to the ancient world. Insofar as the spirit of his revelation is concerned, he belongs to the modern world. In him, life discovers other sources of knowledge suitable to its new direction." Other sources of knowledge are discovered through the revelation of Islam. Other sources of knowledge which were largely missed or ignored by the ancients, particularly by the Greeks and anyone who followed them. "The birth of Islam is the birth of inductive intellect. In Islam, prophecy reaches its perfection in discovering the need of its own abolition." Now, when we talk about the abolition of prophecy, I don't think he means we don't heed old prophecy. I think Iqbal is pretty traditional, or you could say orthodox Muslim. I think he thinks the Quran is a revelation from God, and no need to talk about abolishing that. It's the real thing. It really is a revelation from God. It is a prophecy. It is what God told us, and we're not abolishing that prophecy. No, what we're abolishing is continuing prophecy. In other words, I think he's just talking about that one particular important Islamic doctrine, that revelation has ceased, that the Quran was the final revelation. So prophecy discovers the need of its own abolition. This involves the keen perception that life cannot forever be kept in leading strings, that in order to achieve full self-consciousness, man must finally be thrown back on his own resources. So the idea that prophecy ceases in Islam, Iqbal says, is, at least in part, a realization that we can't just be continually led by God by one prophecy after another. No, we need to, at some point, grow up and think for ourselves and make our own way in the world. Not without the old prophecy. We keep the last one. It's the real deal. But part of what that prophecy itself teaches is that we must learn to think for ourselves, stand on our own 2 feet, learn to live and think and act in the world reasonably without being taught again and again anew all the time by some new prophecy. The abolition of priesthood and hereditary kingship in Islam, the constant appeal to reason and experience in the Quran, and the emphasis that it lays on nature and history as sources of human knowledge are all different aspects of the same idea of finality. Again, it's not that there's no prophecy anymore, it's that there's just no new prophecy. The old prophecy is still there, but it was the final one, And it also included a lot of appeals to nature and history and reason. And what did he just say? The birth of inductive intellect. The birth of Islam is the birth of inductive intellect. And this finality of prophecy, in that particular sense that we don't get any new prophecy, is telling us, okay, human beings, now you've got to think for yourselves. Now you've got to reason for yourselves. Learn from these sources of knowledge. What sources of knowledge? Chapter 3 is going to talk about 3 sources of knowledge: inner experience, history, and nature. And I'll probably read some brief remarks on all of them. I don't think I'm going to even try to be detailed or systematic, though. The first thing he talks about on the subject of inner experience is mysticism. He says, mystic experience has not ceased to exist as a vital fact. Let me give the full sentence. The idea, however, does not mean that mystic experience, which qualitatively does not differ from the experience of the prophet, has now ceased to exist as a vital fact. So, well, you got to be careful here if you can. Qualitatively, mystic experience does not differ from the experience of the prophet. So, I think if you want to get technical, mystical experience is the basic kind of religious experience, and prophetic experience is a particular variety of mystic experience, which has the characteristic that the person who has the experience is then led to go back to the world and creatively transform the world in light of that experience. And we don't get prophets anymore, but we still get the mystic experience. It has not ceased to exist as a vital fact, etc., etc. Mystic experience, then, however unusual and abnormal, must now be regarded by a Muslim as a perfectly natural experience open to critical scrutiny like other aspects of human experience. Mystical experience, as he said before, I believe in chapter 1, mystical experience is open to critical scrutiny. Examine it, test everything. This is clear from the Prophet's own attitude toward Ibn Sayyad's psychic experiences. The function of Sufism as in Islam has been to systematize mystic experience, etc., etc., but inner experience is only one source of human knowledge. So I think that's the limit of his brief commentary on inner experience in chapter 5, in which he tells us it's still a source of knowledge. Mystical inner experience is still a source of knowledge, but think critically about it. And, hang on, let me rewind just a bit. Critical scrutiny, etc., etc. The function of Sufism in Islam has been to systematize mystic experience, though it must be admitted that Ibn Khaldun was the only Muslim who approached it in a thoroughly scientific spirit. I think he's criticizing Sufism there. You're not really supposed to systematize it, at least not if systematizing implies that you can't approach it with critical scrutiny. You're not supposed to build dogmas out of mystical experience. You're supposed to build careful interpretations of things and subject them to critical scrutiny. All right, but enough about that. Mystical experience is still a source of knowledge to be handled cautiously, carefully with testing. But inner experience is only one source of human knowledge. According to the Quran, there are 2 other sources of knowledge, nature and history. And it is in tapping these sources of knowledge that the spirit of Islam is seen at its best. And now he talks about nature for a while. One thing he says about nature is, it is a mistake to suppose that the experimental method is a European discovery. Where did Roger Bacon receive his scientific training? In the Muslim universities of Spain. So modern European empiricism and using experiments to gain knowledge, he says, is an insight it got from Islam. The first important point to note about the spirit of Muslim culture, then, is that for purposes of knowledge, it fixes its gaze on the concrete, the finite. It is further clear that the birth of the method of observation and experiment in Islam was due not to a compromise with Greek thought, but to a prolonged intellectual warfare with it. So I'm touching on all kinds of things. Huge comments on the history of European thought and the origins of its modern empiricism. Huge comments on the nature of Greek thought as disinterested in the concrete, the finite, as preferring like some Platonists perhaps, to move past the particular world into universal intellect, into Plato's forms, into transcendent reality, and forget the concrete, practical, everyday reality, all of that. And Islam is against this, he says. He says Islam has discovered or birthed the method of observation and experiment by means of a prolonged intellectual warfare with this Greek approach. Knowledge must begin with the concrete. It is the intellectual capture of and power over the concrete that makes it possible for the intellect of man to pass beyond the concrete. Now, you may pass beyond the concrete, but knowledge must begin with the concrete. In other words, begin practically, empirically. Knowledge is not so much something that comes down from above. It's something we build up from the ground up, quite literally from the ground up. Begin with the concrete. So this is, these are aspects of what he's talking about in chapter 5. All this talk about where modern Europe or the modern West got its empiricism, its concrete habits of thought that he's been alluding to, I believe, ever since the first page on the preface, in the preface. Thoughts on that, thoughts on Islam versus the Greeks, thoughts on the nature of mystical experience as a possible source of knowledge, thoughts on learning from nature as a source of knowledge, and eventually thoughts on learning from history. I am not, as I say, going to give a thorough reading and analysis of this. I'm also not going to evaluate all of this. I'm not in a position to evaluate all of this. I don't know enough about the origins of modern science. I do not know enough about many of these things. I think it's probable, I'll give this tentative suggestion for how we might evaluate this. I think it's probable that he's onto something, and it's probable that he's not 100% correct. He's not giving the full picture. I have some familiarity also with other analyses, like the Lectures on Calvinism by Kuyper, where, if I remember correctly, Abraham Kuyper says, no, it was from Protestantism, and specifically from Calvinism, that we got the modern insights like science. Again, I can't evaluate that either. I don't know enough about the origins of modern science. I think it's probably onto something, but I have my doubts as to whether it is both 100% correct and the full picture. The actual details might involve more than one source, and also some philosophical sources, interactions with Renaissance philosophy, and considering some aspects of ancient philosophy, which brings me to another point. I don't think he's being entirely fair to the Greeks. I think he's probably dealing with one aspect of Greek thought, one very prominent aspect of Greek thought, probably, but not the only aspect of Greek thought, which certainly did have room for concrete patterns of thought. I mean, Epicurean empiricism is a thing, for example. So, I don't want to evaluate this, but I can provisionally suggest that all these big statements he's drawing about the nature of Greek thought, the way Islam rejects Greek thought, and the way modern European culture gets its non-Greekness from Islam, all these things are interesting, and I'm not going to evaluate them, but I can provisionally suggest he's probably onto something, but I doubt it's 100% correct and the whole picture. Anyway, let's move towards his remarks on history and wrapping up this video. The anti-classical spirit. Now, this is in the third last paragraph. The anti-classical spirit of the modern world has really arisen out of the revolt of Islam against Greek thought. So, I think I will now see if I can give a one-sentence summary of chapter 5. In chapter 5, then, is saying that when we consider the history of human thought and human culture and human civilization, we find that Islam gives us an emphasis on empiricism, concrete thinking, learning from nature, learning from history, an emphasis on human reason, which is so unlike certain aspects of Greek thought and has contributed to modern empiricism to such an extent that we can indeed say yes on this particular religion in the pragmatic test. In other words, he's arguing, based on these considerations, that Islam passes the pragmatic test of religious experience. Incidentally, after giving this big summary remark, I should probably nod to another analysis that is, from what I understand, rather good scholarship, and may give a different perspective. The work of Rodney Stark of Baylor University on the origins of the modern world and Christian influences is one alternative perspective that might be worth serious consideration. That's all. I don't want to evaluate. I'm just mentioning a few reasons. I have my doubts as to whether Iqbal is, in his particular understanding of history, at least, both 100% accurate in giving the full picture. But that's the worst I can say about it. I'm not a scholar of these matters at all. Anyway, I don't even care. My goal here is to explain what he says in this book. So in this video, if I've explained what he's saying in chapter 5, I've accomplished my main goal. And I hope that myself later, or you, dear listener, dear viewer on YouTube or on Rumble, that you can go and figure out whether he's right, etc., etc. I'm mostly just trying to explain, as I usually do, what the philosophers say. Thanks for watching.